excited to introduce Jimena Almendares. Jimena is a product executive at Facebook, and she leads strategic projects for their Facebook app. She has a diverse and exciting background as both a product and a business leader, including senior leadership roles at Institut and OkCupid. Jimena has worked in 16 countries across North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. And if you weren't already convinced that she has a good case to be made for the most interesting person in the world, she is also a 3-time national ice skating champion and speaks 5 languages. Here's Jimena.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about building for the non-average users and how that leads to building better products. So I am fascinated by the brain, how the brain works. We always know about the left and right brain, and I think that has so many relationships to product. On the one hand, because we need to think about the analytics, but also about the user experience. And even when we're building teams, there's always that relationship towards how do you organize the teams with that sequencing and logic side, but then there's also the empathy and how do you make people come together. So think that that's a reference that I'm going to be coming to fairly often during the presentation as we talk about the different experiments and different areas where we can improve the user experience as we build products. So one of the reasons why I'm so excited about how the brain works is because I see a parallel in my career. As an example, I started my career very embedded in analytics, thinking about supply chain optimizations. Then I went into strategy consulting, and even the first companies that I joined were Facebook and Zynga, that more than 10 years ago were one of the few first companies that were building products using data insights. On the other hand, what it's interesting is that from those companies that I joined, we actually got a lot of information about users. In fact, I'll be giving a lot of examples today from OkCupid. And given that we had access to questions about how do people think and how do they feel, we could actually get a little bit deeper towards patterns that on the one hand match the user experience of people, how are they going through their onboarding flows, to other things like who they were, what was their age, what was their gender, but also if they had had a happy childhood or other things that would allow us to better complete the understanding of users. So today I'm going to be talking about how not everyone is average. And that is interesting, right? We do know that average basically means building for people that take a bigger part of a user base. And in fact, we often are taught in business school, or we use different means on how do we do user personas so that we develop products. And we will often say, for instance, for the shopping side, our typical user is going to be a woman in her 25s to 30s, average income, and located in whatever part of a country. And we use that. Sometimes we even have several. And then we think about, okay, so how do we develop a better product for those users? But I want to show you that even if we took the example of that woman in her 25 to 30 years old, she could actually end up being a non-average user. So let me show you a little bit about that. We're going to use an example by OkCupid. And to give you the context of how we got to that information, know that in OkCupid, we get a lot of information on who people are. Those are the factors on gender, orientation, age. And on the other hand, we have the behavioral data of we can use that permutations of gender plus orientation, gender or location, and actually see how people behave. And what is really interesting is that we can actually not only analyze your behavior, but also how people react to you. So here's an example of how women are judged by men given their attractiveness. And what they will see is that there's actually normal distribution where most women are ranked towards an average, and then the rest that are either very attractive or non-attractive. For men, it's a little bit different, which is kind of funny because it means that women are a little bit tougher with men and they judge that more men are less attractive than they are attractive. But what it's interesting is that when you put those things together, you'll see that these extremes are what I really care about. And what I care about, especially as a chief product officer of OkCupid, was that on the one hand, I had the people that were deemed very attractive, and they were getting inundated but with messages. They would often come to their product and see many, many messages of people that were wanting to get their attention. And on the other hand, we had people that were not getting any messages. What it's interesting is that here we could have, again, someone that we would think was very average, but this is how the people react to you. And it's something that actually could change. As an example, we could see that if someone was in, say, New York City, a person would often have a lower ranking of attractiveness if the same person moved to a market with less supply. So say if the person would move to Kansas or to a smaller city, the same person that had a lower attractiveness rating would actually end up having a higher attractiveness rating. So what it's interesting about that is, how do you think about those people that are in the extremes, that are non-average, so that you can actually build a better product? And here I'm going to give you an example of how we went about that. Is that we realized that some people were not getting any views. In the typical swipe experience, a lot of users would go through many, many different profiles and not liking a lot of people, or doing the other way around. But the problem is that, again, we went to the extremes of some people with a bunch of messages and others with none. So what we built was this new product that we called Flavors. And we used all of the data that we had on questions so that we could actually create like mini collections. As an example, people that had tattoos, but given their answers, we knew that they were really sweet and soft on the inside. Or we had other information about people that love politics, so we put them in the category of political junkies. Or we also had a category that was for women who love people with beard, and men who had them. So we would actually release those connections with only 5 to 10 users at a time. And it was like a daily challenge where people would see the collection, engage with them. And what we saw is that because we were presenting categories of really odd mixes of people, on average, people would like, say, at least 3 or 4 people out of that category, which means that now we had more likes of people that were often not even being seen. So that was a really interesting example where we thought, how can we bring more views into the ecosystem, create an experience that by limiting the number of people that they see, we could actually increase the number of people liked in that set, and actually ended up getting a lot of likes, especially in the people that were often ranked as with lower attractiveness, which meant that now those people were getting more likes, and the people that used to get a lot of messages were getting less messages because now they were better distributed. So that's an example of how it's good to think about everyone, and that even if you would be the average Joe, you don't know how people see you, and in a sea of average Joes, you might actually end up either in the super hot Joe or in the less hot Joe. And now let's talk about what you should do as a PM, and how to always, like, you know how we often have to go from like zooming out and zooming in. So now we're going to talk about zooming out and thinking about system dynamics so that we can fix imbalances. So let me tell you a little bit about something that I find super interesting. When you're thinking about a system, there are sometimes things that make that system grow. An example is, if you have eggs, you have more chickens. If you have more chickens, you have more eggs. So whatever happens, the number of that cycle is just growing. Now let's think about the opposite side. And in this case, it would be chickens and road crossings. The more road crossings, the less chickens, less chickens crossing the road. And that obviously means that you're going to have a decrease in number of, in this case, chickens. And I don't need you to focus on this thing. It looks crazy, but it's basically analysis of the system dynamics of OkCupid. And what we saw is that one of the reasons why people were not getting a lot of matches, it's because they didn't have a high matching percentage. And the reason, it was not that they were just super incompatible with people, but that they hadn't answered enough questions. And as you know, whenever we're building a product and we're doing our onboarding experience, we think about what are the details that are most important to have on that session number 1 or session number 2. It turns out that how we had built the product, we had put the questions all the way to the end. So that was something that perhaps you never got to as part of your onboarding experience. And what that meant is that if you didn't answer your questions, you were going to have a very low matching percentage because we didn't have data, which meant that people thought that you would not get along. So what we did was take this flow that basically shows how you would get started and questions that were part of in a hidden place in the profile, and change it to an experience that we brought to the onboarding flow. We took the most interesting questions that we knew that were going to allow us to get enough signal from our users. We turned them into a swiping experience, so yes or no, and we added them to that onboarding flow even before they uploaded their photo. The astounding results were that with just that one change, we had an increase of 21% in day 7 retention. And it was just because as we zoomed out and saw that system dynamics, we saw the importance of questions, how they related to having a high match percentage, and then it became pretty obvious that we were not doing well for our users by having it hidden somewhere in the product, and instead we could bring it forward and hence giving everyone a higher match percentage. So how are you going to do it to find non-average users and solve the problems? Well, try different data cuts. Try doing users by gender, by location, by age, by the actions that take in the product, or if it's a marketplace, such as shopping or dating, that it's actually kind of similar to shopping in many cases, well, you need to think about that balance between supply and demand. So I'm now going to talk about the last part of our talk, which is going to be about how you can focus on non-average users, in this case, underrepresented people, to improve the product for all of the users. And that's another example from OkCupid. So in OkCupid, when we started, we had a very binary view of the world. We had women and men, and we had only 3 sexual orientations: straight, gay, or bisexual. And the thing is that it was very complex because how we had coded the product, it was with zeros or 1. If not men, else woman. And when you're thinking about adding much more bigger range of genders and sexual orientations, you realize that if you all have a binary system embedded in the code, how do you go about that? So we went through a lot of user research, tried to figure out what would be the different permutations where we could match people. And we realized that we could create an extra category and actually solve for most cases that way. That's how we went from a world of men and women and the 3 sexual orientations to 22 genders and 13 sexual orientations. What was really fun about this experience is that whenever you're working on underrepresented people, it's very difficult to get things perfectly right. And even a very good example of this is that how do people describe queer or heteroflexible? Like for us to, whenever we were having those explanations or those tags in our product, to even think about giving them a definition if people wanted to know more, it seemed like a daunting task. So what we did instead is that we used our very creative side, and we created this website where we actually asked our young users that if they tag themselves in a certain way, they could tell us what did that mean to them. And we ended up then creating this landing page that had descriptions of every single user and what they had added for their own word. And when we were going through the onboarding flow, if people wanted to know more about that specific word, we would actually get them to this identity webpage with the descriptions that our users had provided. That way, it allowed us to know that they dictate what was the one perfect definition about something that is by definition very flexible, and instead use the words of our users to define themselves. Another very quick example is that when you're thinking about the supply and demand for certain groups, in the case of Facebook, we actually are right now, we developed a hub that is called Live Black Voices, where we focus on the experience of the Black community. We thought so that it's always about balancing that supply and demand, and that we needed to also have content that was coming from Black creators. So we didn't just then think about, oh, let's launch this hub, but we also developed a program for Black creators where we're teaching them how to build content, how to create an audience, so that when people come to this hub, there's actually content by Black creators. And what does that mean for when you're building product? Is that in the case, for instance, for OkCupid, by having all of the different genders and orientations, people would describe themselves and find the person that they wanted. We could hence have better accurate matches and therefore more happy users. And that was really great because sometimes we would get emails, say from transgender people that were saying, I am being put in super awkward situations where you're asking me to put in a very binary gender that doesn't describe me. Then I go to dates and it's really bad for both myself because I need to now provide information that I would have liked to provide before, and also for the person that is coming to the date. And what was really sweet to see was that many times we received emails of people saying like, hey, I wasn't getting the right matches before, and now after this change, I was able to describe myself for who I am, and people that wanted people just like me, now we're able to reach out, and we would oftentimes get wedding pictures of people that were able to be matched after they were able to represent who they were. So with that, we summarize that there is a lot of benefit in building for non-average users, even if you think that you are the average Joe, how to go about solving for those extremes, and how to even use system dynamics to think about the zooming out and understanding how your whole ecosystem works. And then we talked about how even for non-average users that do belong to underrepresented minorities, focusing on them can help the ecosystem as a whole, as we talked about for the genders in OkCupid. And on the other side, the nuances of building, say, for racial groups, and in the case of the Black community, we knew that we needed to solve the problem both on the supply and the demand, and hence thought about building a Live Black Voices hub, but also then focusing on Black creators. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm really looking forward to catching up through any of those different social media names. Thank you so much. Have a great day.